I just typed into ChatGPT, write me a short YouTube video intro for a video about being productive, episode 0 of becoming that schoolgirl. And yeah, that ain't the intro we're doing. So, hello there, welcome to my channel. My name is Zoe, and this is, like I said, episode 0 of becoming that schoolgirl. That schoolgirl to me is somebody who's productive, who wakes up on time, gets everything that she wants to get done, studies for hours, gets the best grades, works out consistently, and is working towards that future self that she wants to be. Oh, this is episode 0 of that, because is it really being that girl yet? No. But we're working towards it. So, episode 0. Let's go. 8 o'clock in the morning.
It's like we're almost there and then I turn around and you're not there anymore. But how could you leave me in the club? Okay, I guess you must have.
Good morning. Look at my skin. I mean, I didn't do my skincare routine, but it's still kind of irritated. Like if I rub it, I still feel it kind of hurts. The mask from yesterday, I did sleep incredibly. I'm back home. Full day of school has been completed, but I don't really know what I'm gonna do now. I kind of want to work out, but I prefer doing that in the evening when it's less warm and there are less people from my school everywhere. I don't know what I'm gonna do, so I have been procrastinating for the past hour. I think I'm gonna start doing some homework, being productive. For an example, the group project assigned to us for physics, I can start doing that. That would be smart. Probably, maybe, surely.